So apparently V-Clan Collection is all about powerful going first strategies that are actually more powerful going second. Stand up! Vanguard! Hey Cardfighters, welcome back to another Cardfight update, and today we've got yet again 2 more clan reveals for the upcoming V-Clan Collection or Clan Selection. I keep forgetting which one it is, but we got 2 more clans, and we already knew we're gonna get Oracle Think Tank with more Tsukuyomi support, but the second clan is none other than Nubatama with a brand new Hosen ride line. So without any further ado, let's jump straight into these cards because they have a lot of interesting things to tell us, and also there are quite a lot of interesting combos and strategies that will arise from these new cards. So we're going to start off with the new Oracle Think Tank cards, and yes, we already expected this, but they're all going to be Tsukuyomi support, so we're going to see a lot of interactions with the Tsukuyomi ride line, and of course as a main payout with the grade 3 Full Moon Tsukuyomi. So first off, we got a new grade 1 in the likes of Miko of Mirror Moon Sei, and Sei has the ability auto, when this unit is placed on the Vanguard circle, search your deck for up to 1 Goddess of the Crescent Moon Tsukuyomi, write the stand, and shuffle your deck. This is very simple. It's basically, it substitutes as yet another Tsukuyomi for your grade 1 ride, because you can either ride the actual Tsukuyomi or this that will search it out. Now the interesting thing here is that now you actually have 2 options if you have both the grade 1s in your hand, because you can just ride the normal Tsukuyomi from hand. But if you have this grade 1, you can also just ride it to then deck filter 1 card from your deck, because it will just search it out, and it's also 1 extra free soul. So it might be more beneficial to ride this card instead of the actual Tsukuyomi from hand. But maybe you want to keep it in your hand because she also has a secondary effect that can also come up later down the line, because it is act on rearguard circle once a turn. If your opponent's Vanguard is grade 3 or greater, cost, put another grade 2 or less rearguard into your soul, look at 2 cards from the top of your deck, choose up to 2 cards from among them, put them on the top of your deck in any order, and put the rest on the bottom of your deck in any order. So for minusing 1, you can manipulate the top 2 cards of your deck, which isn't great. But the whole thing about this card effect is that this will synergize with the Tsukuyomi skill, because the grade 3 Tsukuyomi has an ability where you want to have 3 Tsukuyomi cards in the soul, because if you use her skill then, you can draw 3 cards and you can check the top 5 and stack 2 cards on top of your deck. That is what you want to have, but by just normal riding, you will only have a grade 1 and a grade 2 in your soul if you get the entire ride line, which means you're missing 1 Tsukuyomi in your soul. You can fix this by riding new Tsukuyomi the following turn, or you can have skills that put cards into the soul. This card allows you to forcefully put one of the grade 1 or grade 2 Tsukuyomis into the soul and be ready once you can do this. The only thing is, your opponent needs to be at grade 3 or greater, so this is a going second strategy, because either you go first, you cannot get the full Tsukuyomi skill, but you can just use your skill. Next turn, you ride a new Full Moon Tsukuyomi, and you have your full power ready. But if you went second, that's 1 turn too slow. Now this card effect will then say, don't worry, we're gonna fast forward 1 extra turn, but just putting 1 Tsukuyomi in the soul just right now during the main phase. And now that you can stack 2 more cards, you can basically get to the top 7 instead of the top 5 to get to triggers. So if the top 2 cards are no triggers, you can send those 2 cards to the bottom of the deck and then check the top 5 with the actual Tsukuyomi unit. Now if we move up to the grade 2, we got even more support in this lineup, as we got Miko of the Round Moon Fujo, and Fujo has the ability auto, when this unit is placed on a Vanguard circle, rearguard circle, cost, counter +1, draw a card, choose a normal unit from your drop, and put this on the top of your deck. If your opponent's Vanguard is grade 3 or greater, you may put it into your soul instead of the top of your deck. So again, this is very similar to the grade 1 we just discussed. It's another type of card that really works well with Tsukuyomi, because not only do you just draw a card, but her second part of the skill might sound bad, because you're forced to either put a normal unit on top of your deck, which means you're basically screwing yourself out of getting triggers. But if your opponent is grade 3, so you went second, you can put the card from your drop into the soul, which is another way to get a Tsukuyomi grade 1 or grade 2, or maybe even a grade 3 into the soul by your first grade 3 ride turn if you went second, which is great. Then again, putting a normal unit on the top of your deck might not actually be that bad within Oracle Think Tank, because we got a couple of cards that actually work well with this type of interaction. If we go back to the Susanoo playstyle, we have Ichikishima as well as Goddess of the Sun Amaterasu, and those cards, if they're revealed from the top of the deck, interact similarly as a trigger unit. This card allows you to set those cards up from the drop on the top of your deck and basically get more value through that. There are also other cards that reveal the top card of your deck during the battle phase and then get variance effects via those things. The Diviners are a good example. You have Diviner Machihiko that gets a guard restrict depending on what type of card you revealed. So this card can actually set up that Diviner grade 2 to have a better consistent finishing option. So this is another very flexible card that is very good for Tsukuyomi, but it's also very good for just generic options within Oracle Think Tank. It becomes even better if we take a look at the new grade 3. Because yes, we have Goddess of the Sun Amaterasu, which is a grade 3 that we actually want to have on the top of our deck. But this card is also really good, as we've got Royal Miku of the Moonbow, Tsukuyomi. And Tsukuyomi has the effect Continuous in Trigger Zone. This card is regarded as a trigger unit instead of a normal unit. And it also has the effect, although when this card is revealed for your drive check, choose one of your Vanguards and until the end of turn, it gets power plus 10k and costs counter plus 1, it gets a critical plus 1. So you might think to yourself, how does this work differently from Goddess of the Sun Amaterasu? There are quite a lot of differences that make this card more desirable in one build and less desirable in the other. The main difference between this and Amaterasu is that Amaterasu binds herself, so you cannot reuse it, and Tsukuyomi goes to the hand because it's still being drove checked, and then you can put it into the drop zone and then maybe put it back on top of the deck with your various skills, including the grade 2 that we just talked about. So this is a card that can be used over and over and over again. The issue, however, is that this card doesn't interact with Susanoo as well as Diviner Kurokazuchi, because those cards reveal the top card and then they activate the trigger effects or whatever effect they have when they are revealed and then add them to hand. That means they never hit the trigger zone. That then also means this card will never activate. So this card is not good in that interaction, whereas Ichikishima and Goddess of the Sun Amaterasu are actually really good in those interactions. But what this card actually does, which those cards cannot do, is that this makes Tsukuyomi, the grade 3, even more devastating. Because this grade 3 Tsukuyomi has an ability where if you drive check 2 triggers during your drive check, you can give the entire front row or 3 units plus 10k power. So you want to hit 2 triggers at all times. Now, Ichikishima and Goddess of the Sun Amaterasu don't count as triggers, so they don't interact with that ability. This grade 3 does. So you can stack this card on top of your deck and still be able to fulfill that condition for that skill. But on top of that, this also interacts still as a normal trigger, as you still give 10k power to the board, and you can potentially give your Vanguard the extra critical, which is great for just pressuring your opponent all around. And the fact that you can cycle this with the grade 2, and we also have Diviner Muto, which can send normal units to the top of the deck, it makes it even better because you can just use this card over and over and over and over again to keep pressuring your opponent with that extra free power turn after turn after turn. So as we can see, this new Tsukuyomi support is very top heavy, where it wants to basically go second and then make the Tsukuyomi full power on the very first grade 3 turn. Now if you go first, you don't really have the consistent full power options, as these grade 2s and grade 1s only work if your opponent's at grade 3, but at the very least, if you went second, you don't have to lose or be a turn behind your opponent, because you can catch up that particular turn to immediately go into a full power Tsukuyomi, which is great. And for the players that went second, we still have options to turbo into our soul to still have potentially a full power Tsukuyomi on turn 1, or should I say on turn 3. But Oracle Think Tank is the only clan that we got support for, as we also got the new Nubatama units, and they are actually quite interesting. So first off, we've got this grade 1 martial artist of laceration, Hozan, and this Hozan has the ability, although when a unit is placed in the Vanguard circle, look at the 7 cards from the top of your deck, choose up to 1 grade 2 or greater card with Hozan in its card name from among them, reveal it, put it into your hand, and shuffle your deck. We've seen this skill time and time again. It's just a top 7 searcher for 2 specific cards. We know what this card does. But then it also has the effect, although in Rearguard Circle, at the end of the battle this unit attacked or boosted, choose one of your opponent's rear guards, return it to their hand. This effect is mandatory. Now for anybody that's questioning why does this specify this, every auto effect that doesn't have a cost is technically mandatory as long as you meet the condition that the skill will activate. So that's the reason why they specified this. You don't have a choice. If this thing attacks or boosted, you're going to be forced to bounce one of your opponent's rear guards if they have any. This is a bit different than we're used to from the Nubatama, because usually when they bounce units, they immediately force our opponent to discard a card. So this effect doesn't necessarily minus your opponent. On the contrary, it can actually benefit your opponent if they have on-place effects, because now they can reuse those on-place effects turn after turn after turn after turn. So you need to be careful with this. Luckily there's a payout, but at the very least you need to be careful with this. That said, it's costless. So this is a very nice card to keep getting value of bouncing our opponent's units. Good example is Tsukuyomi Kongo, because he can generate a guard restrict, which basically means those cards you just bounce back to their hand doesn't really mean anything. And because it's free, you can use this turn after turn after turn without wasting your counterblast or soul blast with minimal payout. So this can be an interesting tech choice if you needed a bounce application but you don't want to waste counterblast or soul blast. Now if we move up to the grade 2, we see Master Swordsman of Successive Victory, Hozan, and it has two abilities from which one is Auto and Vanguard or Rearguard Circle. When a unit attacks a Vanguard, choose one of your opponent's rearguards, return it to their hand, and if your opponent's Vanguard is grade 2 or greater, this unit gets power plus 10k until the end of battle. So this is a bit better. It has the same effect that it can bounce a unit for free, but now it can also get an additional 10k power on top of it, which then compensate for them getting more cards in their hand from which they can guard. If you hit a grade 1, great, you basically negate the amount of shield value that it generated. If you bounce a grade 2, you basically got 5k power over them in the raw value that they need to waste if they want to guard the attack. But then on top of it, it also got a very interesting Vanguard ability that surprisingly is generic, as it has auto. When a unit is rode upon by a grade 3, if your opponent has 3 or more rear guards, choose one of your Vanguards and it gets critical +1 and drive +1 until the end of turn. That's free! That's a free +1 and a critical which pressure your opponents. Depending on what type of grade 3 you go into, that can be quite devastating. With Tsukuyomi Kongo, which can come with a guard restrict, which can make it nasty. Of course, it's synergized with the brand new grade 3 Hozan. But it also surprisingly synergizes very well with Jamio Kongo, because the way how you can counteract Jamio Kongo's skill is by calling units to the field so your hand size is low, so you're not forced to discard cards. But by doing that, you place cards onto the field, which then will activate this ability as they have more than 3 rearguards on the field, which is kind of ridiculous. But the annoying part about this particular skill is this is definitely a going second effect, because if you go first, your opponent will probably not call a lot of units in the early game as they cannot really capitalize on it all too much. Usually on their grade 3 turn, when they're going to do their push turns, that's when they're going to dedicate a field, and if they have a field that cannot disappear, that's when you're going to generate value of it. But at the very least, it is nice, and depending on the grade 3 that you have, it can synergize into that play. A good example is the brand new Hozan, which is Sword Saint of Invincibility, Dai Hozan. And Dai Hozan has two effects, from which one is Auto and Vanguard Circle. When this unit attacks a Vanguard, cost Counter +1 and Soul +1, choose one of your opponent's rear guards, return it to their hand, and until the end of the battle, this unit gets power plus 5k, drive +1, then if your opponent's Vanguard is grade 3 or greater, and they have 1 or less rear guards, this unit gets power plus 10k, and critical +1. So this unit can either become a 17k triple drive Vanguard, or a 27k triple drive double crit Vanguard the moment it attacks, depending if you went first or second on your first grade 3 turn. Now, if we include the grade 2 that we just talked about, it can potentially be, if we went second and our opponent's already grade 3 and we can bounce back their field, it can become a 27k quadruple drive triple crit Vanguard attack. Let that sink in. That's ridiculous. That the amount of value you generate and the pressure against your opponent, they need to block this attack or they're going to hurt a lot. And 4 drive checks is pretty ridiculous. For just a Counter Blast and the Soul Blast, sign me the fuck up on that one. This is crazy. But you might think to yourself, well, you can just perfect guard it, or it's not that high, it's just 27k. Yes, you have 4 drive checks, but they might not hit triggers, so it can potentially be quite guardable. That is until we include 2 other grade 1 cards that Nubatama has access to. We can add in Stealth Fiend card Oboro, or Oboro card, which basically we call it behind the Vanguard, and we double the Vanguard power, which means with including the boost of the Oboro card at that point, will be a 62k quadruple drive triple crit Vanguard. Okay, you might perfect guard it. Well, we have Stealth Fiend Togoga Juji, I believe, which is in grade 1 promo. That basically says that it can retire itself for a counterblast to give your Vanguard the Sentinel restrict. Yeah. If you have that play, That is pretty crazy. Depending on what your opponent does on their first grade 3 turn, that can hurt. And maybe if you have access to that play, maybe sticking around on grade 2 for a turn might actually be the play. Like, I'm not gonna lie, a 62k quadruple drive triple crit Vanguard is kind of hard to deal with if you cannot perfect guard it when it comes with the Sentinel Guard restrict. So yeah, that is a pretty spicy play. Like, that is just a Exodia type situation which what you can create with this card if you combine it with the grade 2. But its actual main value lies in its second effect, which makes this card in this deck have a very interesting mechanic and gimmick where your opponent needs to play around, which is Auto and Vanguard Circle. When your opponent's normal unit is placed on the Vanguard Circle during their turn, if your opponent's hand has 4 or more cards, your opponent chooses a card from their hand and discard it. So basically, every time they want to call a card from the hand to the field, they need to discard another card from their hand. And now we suddenly understand how the grade 1 and the grade 2 work. Yes, they bounce back for free, and they don't force your opponent to discard, but they go into discard the moment they want to recall those units to the field. That means it's going to be very awkward for your opponent if they don't call cards in the early game. The longer they wait with calling cards, the more it's going to hurt them in the first place the moment that Daihozan hits the field. And that's where the grade 2 Vanguard on right effect comes into play, because effectively they want to dedicate as much cards to the board as soon as possible so you don't have to pay the tax of Daihozan. Because the interesting aspect of this grade 3's ability is that the discard ability doesn't have to come from the bounce effect in the first place. Like every other Nubatama card that can force your opponent to discard has to do with the fact that they need to dedicate a field and that you can bounce them and then they are forced to discard. If you cannot bounce their cards, they don't have to discard anything in the first place. Whereas with this card, if they try to do something like that, they still at some point need to dedicate cards into the field, which then forces them to discard again. And what's even more crazier about this particular aspect is that this can screw over superior call multi-attack decks. Like something like Nitros, if they want to dedicate that superior call and go for 5-6 attacks in a turn, every time they superior call a normal unit, which they are going to do with Skull Dragons and whatnot, they have to keep discarding cards from the hand to facilitate that call. Because this thing doesn't specify normal calls, it just specifies normal units that are placed on the Vanguard Circle. Doesn't matter how. So this is a very interesting Vanguard ability that can actually generate a lot of value but might not be as obvious on first glance. Add that on top of the crazy Exodia play where you can generate a 62 quadruple drive triple crit Vanguard with a Sentinel Guard restrict on top of it. Oh my god, I'm actually loving this. This is such a cheese deck that it's perfect. It's so annoying to play against. There's so many things you need to think about. And the crazy part of it all, if your opponent knows how to play against it, you can just tag in or add in as tag options just 1 or 2, maybe a playset of Jamio Kongo, and just go into that to just screw them over if they have a full hand that they're not dedicating anything to the field to circumvent this ability. Just force them to discard that way. I mean, it's there. It's an option. But that said, those are all the reveals that we got for V-Clan Collection or Selection. I'm never going to get that right, but those are all the reveals that we got so far. I'm very interested in what these cards actually can do and how they will impact, because the Tsukuyomi supporter is interesting. It basically makes them go better on the going second strategy, but I don't know if it will actually propel them the strategy forward enough to make it actually matter. But at the very least, it makes that old playstyle more accessible for more players, which is nice because I really like the Tsukuyomi playstyle. But what I'm most surprised about is Daihozan. Like, the Hosan cards are pretty interesting, and I'm very curious how good they're actually going to be. Like that Exodia play, I just like the idea of it. I don't care if it's cheese or I don't care if it's not good enough. Just the fact that I can do that and just cheese a lot of wins. It brings me back to the Gauntlet Buster days of the early V series, which were great. So honestly, I cannot wait to see how this card will function and how the overall interaction of this card will generate with the new call restrict, which opens up an interesting dynamic. So I'm very curious what your guys' thoughts are on these cards. So let me know in the comments down below all your thoughts. That said, I want to give a huge shout out to my Patreon supporters over at patreon.com/VanguardInsider. You guys are amazing. If you do want to support the channel or everything that's happening on the channel, you can simply go to patreon.com/VanguardInsider and become a Patreon as well. But with that said, I've been Mr. Time Leap. See you guys in the next one!